Welcome, everybody. We really appreciate being here today, and thank you for the invitation to FairCon to speak. We will be doing this in a recorded session, but we will have a live chat during the activities during the actual conference. To get us started, I just wanted to kind of give us a brief introduction to each of our speakers. I'm Emery Csulak. I am the Principal Deputy Chief Information Officer for the Department of Energy. Previously, I was the Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Energy. I was the Chief Information Security Officer and Senior Privacy Official at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, and the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the Department of Homeland Security. So next, we've got a team of people who've been working with us for about 2 years, trying to get FAIR and deployed here at the Department of Energy and partnered with across the federal government. So why don't we start with Dan? You want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Dan Lagraffe. I'm Director of Cybersecurity Operations at the Department of Energy, and I'm leading the implementation of FAIR across DOE.
Okay, Natalie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natalie Priani, Cybersecurity Strategy and Risk Management Manager with Accenture Federal Services.
And Cody.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cody Scott. I'm the Chief Cybersecurity Risk Officer at NASA. I'm working to stand up the Cyber Risk and Resilience Program.
Okay, thank you guys very much. Let me switch over to our presentation today. So getting started today, just like to thank everybody for joining us as our speakers, as we mentioned before. So as we started about almost 2 years ago, it'll be 2 years in January, we started looking at figuring out how we and where we wanted to go in terms of embracing quantitative risk management to complement where we were going as an organization. Some of the things that we really looked for is something that's going to help us and become one of the tools that cybersecurity professionals can use when talking with business professionals. We wanted capability to talk about risk in a more quantitative fashion, to talk about the dollars and the values associated with risk and how we can make better informed or more informed decisions as we go forward. So I'm just going to go through our speakers here. I think, Cody, you wanted to kick off with, what are some of the upfront benefits you guys have seen since implementing quantitative risk management going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Emery. So I would say right up front, changing the way that we communicate, that was kind of the day one benefit. So what I mean by that is the way that we've sort of gotten started at NASA is that we're running 2 different pilots. We were focusing on a tactical pilot and a strategic pilot in terms of kind of decision making. And in doing that, getting the stakeholders to the table and using FAIR as the basis for talking through kind of the inputs that we would need for a risk analysis. The first step in doing that is getting everyone on the same page. So when we say the words like threat, vulnerability, when we talk about what risk is and what it's not, that really kind of grounds everyone on the same topic. So I think for us, that's kind of been the biggest upfront benefit.
Okay, Dan?
I think for me, really kind of getting out of the gate, quantitative risk management work has demonstrated value in its ability to kind of make quick data-informed investment decisions. It's one of the best ways to get leadership attention, especially. So, by leveraging FAIR and kind of a blended risk management methodology, you can really fairly quickly after beginning a program like this, assess the kind of return on investment of a product or service. There's a lot of products and vendors out there that are coming around to folks in the cybersecurity business and claiming to buy down your risk, reduce your risk. And what this allows us to do is actually assess in our environment, is that claim true? And if so, how much? And I think for me and for leadership, another kind of rewarding benefit is really the integrity piece. So as opposed to just kind of sticking your finger up in the air and making your best guess, which is kind of, the cartoon of qualitative risk management, we're able to kind of put some data and research behind our decisions and demonstrate that to decision makers as they make these cybersecurity investments. So, that for me, out of the gate, that's been the upfront benefit.
Okay. I think, when we started this endeavor, we really had certain things in mind in terms of where we wanted to be. But now that you've kind of been, using it for a period of time, What are some of the longer term benefits that you've seen or experienced as you're kind of deploying this? So why don't we start with Natalie?
Sure. So kind of echoing Cody's sentiments for one of the more immediate benefits, one of the longer term ones that we're seeing is really a change in perspective and mindset to risk management. So as we see stakeholders becoming more familiar with quantitative risk management, as we see them implementing it more in their programs and making greater investments into training and education for it, we're seeing that this is giving us a better perspective for the agency into what some of the gaps and resources are that headquarters can provide or that we can support. And it's also giving us a better perspective for the overall risk landscape and some of the trajectory and objectives that we need to focus on going forward. So while the program is still relatively new, we've seen some really long-term actionable things that we can pursue as we move forward.
Okay. And, just for reference purposes, Dan and Natalie work with me at the Department of Energy. And just to put this in perspective, Cody's coming from a NASA perspective to kind of give it a little bit of a different spin on this. So Cody, what are some of the longer term benefits that you're starting to see since you've been talking about this as long as we have been at your agency?
Yeah, absolutely. So from that different perspective, we're probably not at the same level of maturity as you guys are by any means, but the approach that we've taken is really kind of looking for building that broader community of interest. So we've really tried to look at how we can apply risk management in an integrated way with a lot of the project teams across NASA. So one of the longer term benefits that we're hoping to realize is that we get more folks to the table, that we can do kind of this true integrated risk management approach where we have not just security, but our other disciplines that are working with us. So in NASA, the way that that's structured is you have your mission support side, and then you have your mission side, and that's kind of broken into different portfolios. So what we want to do is kind of get in to those environments to talk to them. So the way that we're doing that and kind of the long-term benefit that we're hoping to realize is because we see ourselves as that important function that's enabling those other teams in our organization collectively, we're working to kind of present cybersecurity risk management and present IT risk management as a sort of value optimizing work stream that can help these projects better consider the risk that they have and make better decisions. So again, it kind of just goes to this integrated model, but the sort of externality that you get out of that is when you have cybersecurity talking to these project teams, which for us, that kind of represents the business, you start to really demystify cyber and you start to really kind of take away some of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that a lot of these folks who don't sit in cybersecurity that they might have. So you actually start to kind of present yourself as more of this solution-oriented partner rather than just kind of the traditional view that, security is the requirements juggernaut and they're coming in and trying to say no. So it's really kind of that culture shift, but also that project-oriented shift.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to move on, and just to kind of put this a little bit in context for the audience, we've spoken on this type of topic previously, but we really wanted to give you something that you could take back with you. So these slides hopefully will be available to you after the session is completed. But what we really wanted to do is give you something that you can actually take back. And we're going to talk to these slides, but really it is something that you can take with you to kind of think about as you're developing your own programs. So why don't we get started on this slide? We're talking a bit about some of the challenges associated with deploying a new program. So why don't we start with Cody? What are some of the initial challenges you face in developing and deploying a quantitative risk management program?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for us, and I think this is true for a lot of organizations, but it really comes down to boiling the ocean. I think if you're involved in the FAIR Institute at all, I think you hear from a lot of folks who talk about don't boil the ocean. Well, that's a very easy kind of pit to fall into, and that's certainly where my team was when we got started. So what we did is we thought, we need to build this perfect program that needs to account for every possible way that it can fit into every possible governance structure within our organization. And that got really complicated really fast. It also was not providing any value to the work that actually needed to get done today, or the very real decisions that needed to be made today. So what we decided to do is we realized that figuring all of that out up front wasn't delivering that value. And so we wanted to kind of reprioritize and start to focus instead on how the quantitative approach would enhance decisions. So having those conversations with leadership, working with folks who could benefit from learning the better output that comes from taking a more quantitative approach. And we started to actually develop training and workshops and hosting those workshops with our cybersecurity teams. So one of our big milestones that we had was planning this sort of training workshop with all of the cybersecurity leadership across our organization. And the purpose of that was not to get everyone to be fair experts on day one. That would be crazy to do. I think what we were trying to do rather is present the possible, start to show folks who are in these sort of management positions what the possibility looks like if we use this different methodology. So really, my success factor for that sort of training workshop was to see if folks were even interested. And that was the outcome. We had tremendous interest after that. We had folks kind of reaching out and trying to work with us. And actually the pilots that I mentioned that we are using to kind of pick our program up off the ground, those came out of generated interest from that sort of information sharing and training workshop that we did. So that's kind of been our fundamental way of getting this started and kind of shifting the gears away from the boiling the ocean standpoint, getting everything on paper right, and really just diving into it.
Okay, sounds great. Natalie, I know you were at the forefront of us deploying this at the Department of Energy. What are your thoughts towards some of the initial challenges?
Yeah, so echoing Dan's thoughts earlier on, the notion of analysis paralysis, where we really struggled early on is in trying to get that perfect risk statement, have a complete data set, have all of the inputs ready and lined up to hit the ground running with our assessments. And so what we found is what really worked is just to actually get in there and start practicing and start dealing with incomplete data sets and trying to figure out what information do you already have, what information do you need, and what do you actually need in order to have a successful assessment from start to finish. For us, it was also difficult to identify the right stakeholders. Similar to Cody, introducing the program to folks and getting them even on board was one struggle, but also identifying who the right people in the room needed to be, who were the subject matter experts that could provide the data inputs that we needed for our assessments, particularly in environments that have competing priorities and limited resources. So we created a couple of strategies to get around that, reusable data sets. So over time, we started to group assessments over a similar theme or topic, so we could have data points figured out on the front end that we could reuse over time for multiple assessments. We also started preparing baseline data gathering questions that could be sent ahead of time. That buys down some of the time in the beginning of your meeting of having to sell them on the process or what kinds of questions you're going to ask them or why they're in the room. And then we also looked at bringing in leadership as well, having them as part of the briefs in the beginning, the pitch to do an assessment, the value that the assessment could ultimately provide, and the types of reports and recommendations that they could expect. So doing some of those strategies and investments on the front end really help us move out of just trying to create a perfect solution or a perfect scenario and actually just start getting in there and practicing. Another issue we had a lot in the beginning was just the overall FAIR terminology and how we apply that to the federal space. So things like, what FAIR means for vulnerability versus our traditional understanding through NIST for vulnerability. Things like the FAIR forms of loss. What does competitive advantage really look like in the federal space? What does reputation cost look like in the federal space? So some of that recalibration of those definitions and that understanding also helped go a long way and provide value in those data gathering sessions and help move our analyses forward.
Thank you, Natalie. So I know as part of that conversation, I know at Energy, we focused on a lot on deployment resources. Dan, can you talk a little bit about some of those deployment resources?
Yes, I can. It's a great segue because this is a key part of what helped us get over some of those initial hurdles. And although they might seem simple at first glance, these are kind of two resources we rely on pretty heavily. So one of them is kind of an executive deck, an elevator pitch, for lack of a better term. We found ourselves having to communicate this often to executives at different program offices or agencies oftentimes, and kind of both explain what we were doing and how we were doing it and the benefit pretty clearly in a kind of quick, punchy way. We not only demonstrated risk management approaches, but we highlighted use cases, things we'd actually done, real examples, so they can kind of see themselves in those. And we also, used some of the kind of key assessment types that we had focused on early on, such as the kind of return or investment or cost benefit analysis ones, just so that they could also see a way to get started, and since then, in our kind of current work, we're working on some templates essentially, so that when entities decide they would like to start on their FAIR journey, if you will, they have kind of a template for a certain kind of assessment. If you're trying to go from on-prem solution to the cloud and you'd like to do an assessment, we've got a template for that that'll help you along the way. So, that really was the key resources that we had used, initially and even still. So very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. In addition to kind of our executive messaging, there were a lot of challenges with talking and educating various audiences, the materials that we needed to provide. How did you begin to organize and carry, out those education initiatives to support your program's implementation? Natalie, you want to talk a little bit about what you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we really focused on kind of 3 ways to address the challenge for education. So we looked at tiered training opportunities, calibration techniques, and addressing the applicability issue. So for tiered training, it was important for us to engage newcomers to risk management or quantitative risk management, but also make sure we weren't leaving behind the more mature practitioners in risk management or quantitative risk management. Within the Department of Energy, we have folks across the broad spectrum. So we wanted to make sure that from an educational perspective, we were providing training at each level to help them advance and continue to champion the program's development. So that includes foundational learning, kind of 101 basics, to having more extensive sessions on training focused on techniques that were particularly new and can be a bit difficult to grasp, such as calibration, really diving into how we can get better with our uncertainty, even though it isn't perfect and we haven't solved for it. But how do we apply statistical methods? Why are we using Monte Carlo? What does that really mean? And how does that help us get a better forecast and estimate for our risk exposure? And then finally, for addressing applicability, we really looked at, again, kind of translating and redefining some of those FAIR terms with our current environment, our understanding, and how entrenched we are with NIST guidance, FSMA guidance, other guidances out there, making sure that we weren't speaking 2 different sets of languages, and we were really showing how FAIR and quantitative risk management not only integrates well and supports existing frameworks that we all follow for risk management, but really adds to its value and ultimately, developing a firm understanding of your risk exposure and where you need to address your gaps and what your investments are really doing for you.
Great. Cody, do you have some thoughts on the education challenge?
Yeah, and Natalie made a good point too. The NIST integration piece, that's something that I think folks get hung up a lot on. And I know even kind of within my organization, when talking to people and, talking about the value of quantitative analysis, the question we get back is, well, there's NIST over here, we have to go do that. Don't tell us to do a new process. And what that says to me is really the value of kind of getting folks on the same page with FAIR is going back and being able to kind of do that due diligence and say, NIST tells us to do quantitative analysis. It lays out quantitative analysis as a viable option for doing information security risk management, right? So what we are doing is saying, if NIST is telling us to do this, this is the connector, right? FAIR becomes the method by which we can achieve the intent of what NIST tells us to do. And that satisfies a pretty big step in the capability maturity model for the organization. I think it's really easy to get caught up in mapping all the details of how NIST and FAIR can go together, but I don't think that that's important. I think the important piece here is getting folks on the same page. And in order to do that, those educational resources, such as articulating how this type of analysis fits into the broader 837 kind of discussion of what the risk management process is, that gets you there. That gets folks over that initial hurdle. It gets folks kind of realizing, oh, this is something that we can do. I think also very similar to the DOE experience, something that we've seen is that folks who don't have a lot of training in risk management science in general might not kind of understand the value of quantitative approaches in general. So that's something you have to get over, right? You have to kind of talk about and be able to know and be able to communicate to your stakeholders, your leadership, whomever, on what the benefits are. So you need to be able to kind of speak to, you know, why do existing models, why do they fail? Or why does quantitative methods, why do they excel in certain areas? But you also have to be able to kind of level with people. So having those educational materials that put those in kind of layman terms, that get them, that get people kind of oriented around a common goal, that's really important for the sustainability of making sure that you can push this forward and not have folks looking at it as, oh, that's just another sort of initiative or another pilot that this team is running, but no, this is something that I can actually embrace and understand.
Thanks. You know, I know we're talking about education. We don't have a lot of time, but, you know, Natalie, can you, just kind of talk a little bit, just briefly about kind of like the type of resources that you've made available?
Yeah, absolutely. So we focused on three-pronged educational resource pools. So the first is an introductory deck. That really helps make sure that everyone, again, across the spectrum is at least all on the same square. We all speak the same language. We all understand FAIR and the modifications that we made for the federal space in the same way. And that's through our introductory deck that walks through the FAIR model, the forms of loss, how we define them in the federal space, and how we use them at the agency. Next, we have topical one-pagers on select topics such as calibration. Again, it can be a tricky technique for folks to grasp early on. So we provided a one-pager that is a snapshot summary of what calibration is, how you can use it, and why you might want to use it. And then we have amplification guidance. So we developed a methodology that really, again, focuses on showing how quantitative risk management, whether it's FAIR or through someone else, really complements existing risk frameworks out there that a lot of federal agencies already follow and model their programs after.
Thank you.
Can I make a closing comment on education, Emery? Do you mind?
Of course.
So kind of interestingly enough, I think something else that we've really learned at DOE is it's not only kind of what Cody talks about is trying to fit FAIR into NIST, which works, right? It's mapped, it works, it's good to show, but it's also kind of the idea of how to fit other tools into FAIR. And that's kind of the continuing arc of education, if you will, I think, in kind of quantitative risk management. So, you take introduction to FAIR, you kind of learn how FAIR works. FAIR is kind of a factor analysis of information risk. It's a framework, but learning how to kind of draw the box and wire diagram isn't enough, right? Knowing what the picture that you see there on the overview slide isn't enough. And oftentimes, particularly when you're in data poor environments, which we've found ourselves in lots of times, we really found value in going to, a broad array of resources to get kind of more in-depth education on statistical methods or how to operate in an environment which is not data rich, when you're trying to kind of produce less uncertainty with not a lot of data. So I guess it's important to note that, you also don't want to leave someone with the idea that once they learn what the FAIR framework is, that's going to be kind of it. Because then as soon as they kind of get into their first analysis, they're going to be, they're going to feel challenged, and as we did, right? And that's what we've been working to do is learn over time is what are the broad tools at our disposal to build a FAIR analysis through their framework. And that was really helpful. Some of those speakers are also speaking at FairCon. Everyone's familiar with Doug Hubbard. Risk Lens has some additional resources, and there are many, many others. But the important point there, I guess what I'm saying is learning FAIR is the beginning of the education of how to do quantitative risk management in a FAIR environment, not the end-all be-all. That's all.
Okay. Well, I think that sounds like a great transition, Dan, to the communication challenges that we look at as we go through this process, because, there's a lot of prep you can do, but during the course of a FAIR analysis, you're talking with a lot of people, trying to get them familiar with the process. Can you talk a little bit about some of the communication challenges, Dan?
Yeah, sure. As I was kind of thinking about this this challenge, you can simply bucket into a challenge communicating up and a challenge communicating down. You know, challenge communicating down is kind of what you just mentioned, Emery. It's kind of, you know, you're not going to be able to train your entire, you know, every employee at your organization in FAIR and statistical models and methods, you know, period. You're just not going to be able to. So what happens is you usually train a core cadre of folks, and that core cadre of folks then reaches out to, who knows, depending on the assessment, a team of subject matter experts, managers, and everyone in between. And you have to be able to very quickly and efficiently explain some of the core concepts to them as you take them through this process to get a good calibrated, quantitatively sound result out of them. And so there's a lot there in terms of interview skills, you know, that we've talked about, and being able to use a couple of heuristics and kind of communications skills and kind of talking to these SMEs about things they need to do to make sure that their you know, quantitative range assessments are properly bounded and things like that, because that will greatly improve the outcome on the back end. You know, challenge communicating up is at the end of the day, you've done your analysis, you've dotted your I's, crossed your T's, you've clicked the calculate button and run your Monte Carlo assessment or whatever it is you're doing, and now you've got this result. And what we found at the beginning was, you know, presenting results isn't so easy, and it's often not so straightforward. First of all, oftentimes when you're in a pretty mature environment with regard to cybersecurity controls and policies and stuff like that, and just because of the nature of the way cybersecurity works, I mean, you might, you know, your annual expected loss, you know, might be close to zero, might not be a big scary number, but if you go to executives with that message, well, you've done them a disservice because you haven't appropriately communicated to them what the analysis actually found, which was that, you know, there's a range of risk in dollars, and based on that range of risk in dollars and what the assessment scenario was, here's the action we should take. And some of that could, you know, one of our findings in communication is a lot of those results that you communicate are actually sort of outside the traditional single dollar amount fair outcome. You know, hey, you know, you should probably put X amount of money aside in case a certain thing happens, even understanding that it might not happen in any given year. Or we found that too many things were concentrated in one place, which presents kind of a redundancy risk of sorts. So I think that idea has sort of become a little more well known in the community lately. I know that folks are even focusing some of the initial training and even some of the more advanced trainings on communicating results, because that really is, at the end of the day, why we're all doing this, is to speak business to executives, and that's the language they speak, and we need to be able to speak it too. And you know, so that was something we had to learn very quickly, because the first couple of times we tried it didn't go as we had planned. So that's really all on that, Emery.
Okay, thanks. I know we're running really tight on time here, but Cody, do you have a few statements before we move on?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, one of the challenges too around communicating, you really have to understand the existing risk management practices that exist in your organization, because when folks see the results that come out of a fair analysis, when you start to talk about annualized loss exposure and you talk about your vulnerability percentage and things like that, they're going to look back and say, that's great, but how do my teams interpret that data? What does this project team need to do? Especially when you get into the sort of more mission focused groups that are kind of managing projects relative to requirements, and they're managing against requirements, they're going to really struggle with understanding what to do with some of that data that is quantified in dollars, because they're looking at it from a fundamentally different perspective, which is around achieving requirements. Those are complementary, they completely go together, but it's on kind of the practitioner to really sit down and think through what the objectives are of the teams that you're doing this analysis for, and what decisions they need to make. You need to factor that in how you communicate those results out.
Okay, sounds great. Natalie, you want to just touch on some of the communication resources that we've used?
Sure. So, based on, points that Cody and Dan have brought up, what we really focused on is making sure that we are communicating clearly and that we're developing templates and resources that can be referenced and used by other risk management teams as well. So not just us as the drivers for doing all the assessments, but how do we create a communication package so that other folks doing assessments and briefing their own leadership understand the pitfalls and how to really read the results and present the results. So to that end, we have a read ahead packet that walks through the entire process with some tips and tricks. We also have a program poster that serves as a good visual reminder of the process, of FAIR, of definitions. It's just a quick read ahead or that you can always reference. And then we have reporting templates that, again, help create a consistent, cohesive message to what are the main points you want to pull from a report. What is your leadership really looking for, so that you're not just talking to them in statistical terms or controls, but in actual terms that they understand and that they want to hear and see you out.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've heard a lot about the challenges and some of the education and the opportunities that we've talked about implementing our programs. Why don't we talk a little bit about what are some of the keys to sustaining a program? It was, one thing with initial motivation and excitement to get things started, but it's another thing, as we're closing in on 2 years, how do you keep that motivation going? How do you keep this moving along? Dan, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked, throughout the course of the panel here on the kind of importance of a, bottom-up grassroots approach, building momentum, small executable scenarios to build that momentum. Talked about tailoring to different stakeholders. Talked about successful communication and executive messaging. I guess, one other takeaway that would be relevant, I guess, that I'm finding is kind of, and not to use the question and the answer, but the keys to the sustaining a program is, make it programmatic. And what I mean by that is, as you start, you're kind of dipping your toe in the water. Does this even work? Does it work? And you're just kind of doing any which thing you want, and try one of these and one of those, and with this guy and that person. But in order to sustain it as a program, you need to fully kind of integrate it into what you do, as kind of Cody mentioned. So something we're really doing at DOE is within the office of the CISO, is we're really making FAIR-based quantitative risk management kind of a core piece of everything we do. So it's a core piece of every acquisition that's over $100,000, which is quite a few. It's a core piece of our operations center as they kind of look to analyze different incident types and which ones have the biggest impact in terms, risk-based impact. And, we're also using it to assess vulnerabilities as they come in and to see what the impact of those is and what sort of resources should be put against them and things like that. So I really think that part of sustaining it as a program is to not only show that it works, which we've kind of demonstrated, but also to show that, to make it a key part of all portions of the program. It's, risk management can't only happen in the risk management bubble. Risk management people have to enable everyone else to do risk management, basically. But,
Okay. Cody, I know we're really tight. Anything that you want to contribute to the sustaining a program?
Yeah, so I mean, completely agree with Dan. I think the way that we approached it is we built a program plan from day one. So that was kind of the core activity within our team to get everyone on the same page and to set targets and milestones for what we wanted to be able to offer as part of our program. But it was also aspirational in terms of where we wanted to go. And I think a lot of people talk about, risk management as a cross-cutting function, and people understand that conceptually. But to Dan's point, make it a cross-cutting function. In your program plan, highlight and document exactly how you're going to engage with other services or other operations in your organization so that you can start to work with those teams to now build this out and get everyone on the same page. It's the way of growing that program, and it's the way of making it sustainable by keeping everyone on the same page.
Great. I think as you've been going through this, there's some really common questions that others are interested in, what they need to know about bringing fair and quantitative risk management to the organizations. Natalie, Dan, and Cody, we'll start with Natalie. Do you have one thing that you'd like to kind of convey in terms of like the questions that you hear every day?
Yeah, one of the first ones is why do this? Why is this better than what we have now? What's wrong with our, stoplight risk charts? And the biggest, our response to that is that this is helping you get better at decreasing your uncertainty. It's not a perfect answer. We understand that we don't have full data sets, but this process is forcing you to go out and use the data that you already have, by way of responding to data calls and requirements and everything else that you're subjected to. And then for the gaps that you do have, this process forces you to reach out to those subject matter experts and start building and completing those data sets that you can then use going forward to continuously build upon a stronger foundation for a risk management program, which a traditional, red, yellow, green will not necessarily do, because it's inherently much more kind of subjective. And as we have turnover, it's not something you can consistently build upon with any kind of confidence.
Okay. Dan, is there one question that you hear over and over again?
A lot of times, agree with some of the things Natalie's here, and also it's about team building. When we go to do this, getting the right kind of people on a team can really set you up for success. Diversity and perspectives and backgrounds is key. And also a lot of times when you're doing this work, you can either get lucky and find that unicorn out there that has risk management expertise and cybersecurity expertise and architecture and engineering expertise and knows the system, but a lot of times you don't have all those things in one person. So you also need to kind of set up a system of reach back support, if you will, so that the diverse resources on the risk team know how to reach back to some of the SMEs, in your organization to get the right information. And another key part about having the right people on your team, setting you up for success is, as an example, even if you're not a cybersecurity expert, but you are a risk management expert, let's just say that's your perspective. That's what you bring to the team. It's really critical that you get some exposure to cybersecurity. And kind of what I've seen a little bit is these SMEs, these cybersecurity SMEs, it's like they can smell when someone doesn't understand what they're talking about in cybersecurity, and they feast on it. It's like chum in the water, and really being able to, demonstrate that you're at least passingly familiar with the topics and things they're talking about. It buys you a lot of credibility and willingness for them to really kind of participate with you in this analysis that you're trying to do. So, food for thought.
Cody, any thoughts on, what you hear a lot?
Yeah, and similar to kind of what Natalie and Dan both said, the question, why bother or why do this? But it's a little bit different. It's folks who are already doing risk management from a project management standpoint. So risk management as a discipline of project management, those folks come back and they say, well, I have a risk review board, and if there is a cybersecurity risk that's important enough, it'll come up, and if there's a vulnerability, it'll come up, and we'll deal with it with our process. What we find, though, and what we know in observation and through anecdotes, is that that level of rigor around proactive cybersecurity risk management is in fact not being done. It's not being done consistently, and certainly not to scale. So what we're trying to do is really change that dynamic and build rigor around the discipline itself.
Okay, great. I know we're wrapping up here, and we really hope people can take something that we've talked about today or shown you today and bring it back to your programs. I think the biggest most important message for me is that it's been critical to have these really strong partnerships. Cody's been a strong partner through the government fair chapter. Dan and Natalie have been great, and they've been working with a large number of other federal partners where we want to share those resources both within our department but across the federal government as well. So, just to kind of wrap things up, Natalie, why don't we start with you? Is there one takeaway that you hope people got out of this session and going forward?
Yeah, for me, it's that folks don't get discouraged and they really start small and understand that there are still benefits that you can reap from starting with small, tactical, everyday decisions. What is your boss looking at? What does he need to decide on next week? And how can you use FAIR or any pieces of quantitative risk management to help with that decision? Really just getting out of analysis paralysis and getting started, you can realize benefits right away and start building on that.
Mm-hmm. Dan, what are your thoughts? What's your takeaway?
Yeah, I think I would just echo what Natalie said. Really, that was my thought, is just, just dive in. I've had dozens and dozens of calls with all sorts of different agencies and organizations, of people that are thinking about doing it, but can't quite get themselves to do it. And, you know, really just get started, just jump in. And I think the value will become kind of readily apparent, and you'll figure out a way to make it work from there. So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I'll just clarify, you know, when I sit here, jump in, I hear, start doing analysis, because you don't get better analysis if you haven't started and learned your mistakes and learn that path forward. Cody, what's your takeaway for the audience?
My two takeaways are: one, join the Fair Federal chapter, join. Two, on the kind of idea of just getting started and kind of the boiling the ocean and analysis paralysis, you can get started with something even if you don't have a fully resourced team. We don't have a budget in my organization for doing any of this, but we've been able to get it off the ground and get it going just with the interest that we built alone. So I would say don't get hung up on some of those factors.
Okay. Well, I hope everybody got something out of this, and thanks again, and we appreciate your interest in the topic. Thank you.